From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's what's ahead. K-State's Erick DeWolf reports on leaf rust disease showing up in Kansas wheat stands this fall. He'll talk about the chances of that disease overwintering and requiring treatment next spring. And Eric comments on applying a fungicide now to preserve the wheat foliage as a grazing resource. Also, Sarah Moyer talks with K-State's Jason Hartman about the wildfire potential in Kansas this fall. As late-season plant growth has increased the fuel load across the countryside, he'll look at protective precautions that rural residents can be taking. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Dennis Patton takes a look at winterizing roses. All that and more next on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. As you've been hearing recent broadcasts, we've been keeping a very close eye on Kansas winter wheat conditions, and we'll take one more angle on that today, as there have been reports that concerning disease that we've dealt with in Kansas wheat production for years upon years is actually showing up in fair volume in Kansas wheat this fall. We're talking about leaf rust disease, and we've brought by Erick DeWolf, wheat disease specialist with K-State Research and Extension, to fill us in. So, Eric, leaf rust, producers are more than well acquainted with it, and now it's showing up around and about Kansas. To what extent?
Yeah, so leaf rust is probably our number 2 disease in the state. Stripe rust recently emerged as the number 1 disease in the last decade or so, but historically, leaf rust has been there in the top the potentially most damaging diseases in the state. We often see leaf rust get established in the fall in our winter wheat crop, particularly when wheat is established on the early side. Say for grazing purposes, it's not uncommon to see leaf rust get established. But this year seems to be at least average or even above average in some areas of the state, more severe than usual, largely because of the summer rainfall that we've had in parts of western Kansas.
Primarily in the western part of the state at this juncture?
Interestingly, it is, yeah. So lots of times it's more central Kansas where historically the rainfall patterns in the summer months are more conducive for disease development. But in this year, with the rainfall pattern being switched around a little bit, parts of western Kansas did receive more rain. And many times the disease will cling to existence on good old volunteer wheat that we often talk about or think about with respect to wheat streak mosaic control. But it also affects other diseases, and leaf rust being one of them.
As one would scout their wheat stands in the fall, are we looking for the similar symptoms of leaf rust that we would other times of the year?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So for leaf rust, that's pretty much the case. So we'd be looking for these small lesions about the size of a head of a pin or so that are kind of brown or a brick red type of color. Very typical leaf rust type of presentation in the fall. Stripe rust, however, is a little different. It's possible for us to see some stripe rust this time of year as well. It's more rare for us to see that disease get established in the fall this far north. The difference for stripe rust is that it doesn't form the characteristic stripes, as the name implies, that we see on adult plants and around the heading stages of growth, but rather it looks a little bit more like leaf rust. It crosses over the veins of seedling leaves much more easily and isn't restricted to running parallel with the veins and causing those long stripe-like appearance of the lesions.
So if leaf rust is out there now, what does this portend for the wheat crop in as far as grain production? Is it more of a cosmetic concern at this time, or is it beyond that as we look forward?
Yeah, that's some change in my own thoughts that are going on there. So I think historically we've often viewed these fall infestations of leaf rust as a relatively minor concern. So in most situations, probably roughly 2/3 of the time, winter conditions will eliminate this leaf rust from our wheat crop just naturally. So in most situations, by the time the wheat's actively growing in the spring, it is been taken care of, and there's really no additional need for management. So from a grain production perspective, we've often not emphasized any type of management in the fall. Mm-hmm. In conversations with some growers and consultants in the western portion of the state, they were expressing concern that the forage and quality grazing potential of wheat was being affected by the leaf rust, that apparently it was getting severe enough that it was yellowing up these wheat stands pretty severely and causing some concerns about how of a reliable source of grazing and forage this would be as people looked at pasturing cattle on this wheat.
Now, that is an extra consideration, that is, if in fact you intend to graze that wheat as forage and then take it for grain. And in that circumstance, the question then comes up, if one is committed to grazing wheat or is intending to do so, would an application of a fungicide here in the fall be of benefit?
Well, so we don't have any direct data on that. That's something that we have not researched extensively here at K-State. I think intuitively it does make sense that if you could get a fungicide on in a timely way to prevent the damage of leaf rust, it could have a positive influence on the productivity and forage and grazing potential of that wheat. What we don't know, is there a timing of that's really important? It may, in fact, be that if wheat was planted in August for grazing purposes, that timing of that fungicide, as we're now into November, would have likely had to have been previous prior to this date. Yeah, I think we're probably a little bit on the late side now for that, particularly as we're getting into the colder months of the year here.
But if wheat was planted in, say, October or planted late because of the overly wet conditions, the fair part of October, again, same question, would a fungicide be practical for this purpose?
Yeah, I think the question becomes, is leaf rust going to become established? And as we get to these colder months of the year, colder temperatures tend to suppress the development of leaf rust as well. So it may not be as vulnerable. So this late emerging portion of our crop, which could be considerable this year because of the rain delays, probably is not as much at risk for the development of leaf rust. Always wise to be monitoring what's going on, and if you feel like there's enough wheat there to graze, given the cold temperatures and the late emergence, then it may be something that we keep an eye on. But for the most part, I think that it should be okay.
If, though, to consider all scenarios here, Eric, it is deemed by the producer that maybe they do need to do something about the rust infestation in their grazing wheat, there are fungicides labeled for this option. However, there are considerations there that need to be kept well in mind.
There are some fungicides. If growers do feel like leaf rust is hurting them, they want to try and protect that aspect of their productivity of their operation, then fungicides could be an option here to suppress that fall leaf rust. All fungicides are not equal, though, in the way that they're labeled, and there are some restrictions on many fungicides with respect to when you can begin to chop that for hay, for using it for forage, or for grazing purposes. And there's some subtle differences in the way those things are worded. Just a quick evaluation of a number of those labels suggests that some fungicides don't explicitly have restrictions on it, that aspect of wheat production. Others have a 7-day interval between the time of the application. A few fungicides are closer to the 30-day mark. And so that potentially gets to be a limitation than if people were looking at grazing it this fall as well.
So read the labels before you pull the trigger on that application whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that's always advisable for people to just be aware of what the label restrictions are as they're looking at these fungicide products, just asking those questions to make sure that they're making an informed decision here and don't get themselves boxed into a corner.
and more you need to put a pencil to this whole prospect of application and whether it's going to pay out for you. But looking ahead to next spring and what we know from previous experience about fall infestations of leaf rust on winter wheat and how that might roll over into springtime, typically the cold weather does take care of it, and the rust problems for next spring would have to move in from elsewhere?
Yeah, so that's often the case. So, the one scenario here that, like we said earlier, would about 2/3 of the years, the freezing, thawing, these major swings of temperature that we get where it's 20 degrees at night and then up to the 50s during the day, many times that will cause a lot of damage to the leaf tissue of wheat. So when you damage the leaf tissue, as that tissue declines, it takes the leaf rust fungus with it as well. But remember, 2/3 of the time that would happen, that means that 1/3 of the time, the winter conditions are not sufficient to eliminate the leaf rust from our areas. And usually when that happens here in Kansas, it usually means that it's overwintering in a much broader extent throughout the Great Plains region. And it's those years that we really get into trouble with leaf rust being a severe problem, getting a foothold much earlier in the growing season. So the point of all that is this. This is the take-home message that I think it requires some additional monitoring. If you are aware of your leaf rust getting established in your wheat in the fall, there's no apparent need for immediate management, some things to consider for grazing. But the important message here is to remain vigilant, and you want to be checking those fields where you know there's a history of leaf rust now and making sure that it disappears, particularly as we enter the months of February and March. Those are really critical transition months for our wheat crop in so many ways, but also with respect to disease getting established as well.
There's an article on this very topic, by the way, that you producers might want to have a look at. It's in the E-Update series dated November the 2nd, Wheat Leaf Rust Establishing a Foothold in Kansas, with some management considerations there at agronomy.ksu.edu. And we'll touch base with you once again, Eric, and to see where this is headed and if, in fact, we do end up with a leaf rust issue in the springtime. Thanks for coming over.
You're welcome.
Erick DeWolf is a wheat disease specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Agriculture Today will return in a few moments on this, the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Late, heavy rains this fall allowed forages to grow again, and now with winter temperatures spanning the state, drying, dying forages have the potential to become fuel in a fire. Fire protection specialist with the Kansas Forest Service, Jason Hartman, is in to talk with us about his assessment of wildfire risks this year. Good to have you on, Jason.
Thanks for having me.
With the 2 major California wildfires making headlines, folks may be wanting to be more aware of some of the conditions here in Kansas, and of course areas have experienced some large fires in the past. So walk us through your risk assessment, Jason.
Well, looking statewide, it's somewhat appearing we may be heading into the 3rd or maybe in 4th year of pretty good growing season moisture. We just last week we met with several weather service partners, and most of them had a similar story to tell, that they had average to even above average rainfall in the late growing season. And then now, as you mentioned, we're heading into the dormant season. And so all that fuel that had grown is now potentially available come this upcoming, basically any time between now and green up in the spring, is available to be fuels for a wildfire.
So you collaborate with some other people to help make that risk assessment and be prepared with the Kansas Forest Service, correct?
Yeah, great question. That was the meeting I referenced was a group we call the Kansas Interagency Wildfire Council. It's our agency, the Kansas Forest Service, other state partners, Fire Marshal's Office, the State Chiefs Association, Firefighters Association, Emergency Management, and then the Weather Service partners as well as federal fire management partners. We all kind of collaborate in the fall about this time to kind of see what it looks like upcoming season and try to be prepared better that way.
What type of safety concerns are there for rural dwellers who are out? Maybe they own more property, maybe they just live out there, but what are some things for people to think about?
Probably two of the biggest things, Sarah, would be those that are planning to do prescribed burn as part of their land management, that even now is not too early to be planning for that. You can be putting in fire breaks now. You can be putting in them all winter long. You don't want to wait until it's starting to look like the prescribed burning weather to start preparing, because then you may miss the perfect window and might end up pushing the window to where a day that's not as good weather conditions. And also just looking around the home, look for little things that could catch an ember in a wildfire situation, and those are the ways that we end up getting structures damaged and destroyed, is having those little places where the embers from the wildfire can get close to the house, start a little fire, and then catch the structure.
Let's go back to some of the preparation things that people can be thinking about. You talked about fire breaks. Is there anything else on that checklist that people can do ahead of time if they have some time this winter?
Yeah, I mean, all the planning process can be done quite a ways ahead of time. Planning what your objectives are, what you want to accomplish, what weather conditions are going to be best based on what's downwind as far as roads, highways, schools, neighbors with breathing problems that you want to avoid smoke going that direction. So you can kind of be pre-planning which way you want your smoke to go and looking at the weather conditions that you're going to need to keep it safe. Those fire breaks, look at the fire equipment you might have used last spring over the winter in the shop's a good time to make sure it's all in top order, top working condition, and make sure it's ready for the spring.
People are out in their shops doing some winter maintenance. Think about some of those fire equipment pieces as well to be having maintenance there all at once. In order to kind of help neighbors out, what can people be doing to have good relations with people who, if a fire comes up, they're able to work together?
Yeah, you can just communicate when you are going to be doing any type of burning so that the neighbors know if they see smoke, whether it is something that is an emergency so they know to call right away, rather than wondering, well, maybe that's the neighbor burning a pile or burning some grass. If there's good communication ahead of time, then everybody knows when it is an emergency and can call for help sooner, because that helps keep everything under control, is getting the responders there as quick as possible. So just communicating what your plans are, and you may end up getting a lot of help by just letting folks know what you're planning to do. Be chatting ahead of time always helps.
Another subject relating to fire, maybe if people with the fall season have a lot of debris, leaves and things out in places, that if those fires are not managed, if they're burning some of that, that could be an issue. So what advice do you have?
It's basically you treat those leaf piles, brush piles as just a small prescribed burn. The same concepts apply. You want to check your weather conditions, make sure you have a fire break, even around just a pile, have a little fire break. One thing about those that is, you don't just plan for that day's weather. You actually have to look 3 to 7 days out to make sure you don't have a strong, gusty, windy, dry day coming up, because those brush piles will hold embers and heat for up to that long that could then be kicked out into a wildfire by a gusty, windy, dry day that's several days after you actually thought you were done.
Some good advice there. And any other comments here for people thinking about fire, thinking about their fire risks this season?
Be communicating, be thinking ahead, and don't hesitate to call for help if you think you need help. And that's what the fire departments are here for. They want to help out.
The Kansas Forest Service is offering a National Fire Protection Association training coming up here later in the month. Will you tell us more about the details of the training pertaining to wildfires?
Yeah, it's called Assessing Structure Ignition Potential, and it's a tool for primarily those who deal with property owners. So like what we're thinking of our audience would be fire departments, maybe even natural resources staffs that deal with advice to landowners, or even, I guess, landowners themselves could take it, and you just learn the ways that most people may not think about. It's a lot of case study, a lot of science behind exactly what is it in a wildfire situation that threatens catching the structure on fire. And there's a lot to it that, until you go through a course like that, you don't realize is a threat.
This training is limited to 40 registrants, so you'll want to call in soon to reserve your spot. The Kansas Forest Service State Office phone number is 785-532-3300. Again, that's 785-532-3300. The curriculum is activity-rich, and the sessions will be taught by wildland fire specialists who understand how and why homes and communities are destroyed during wildfire events and the simple things that residents can do to minimize property loss. And the course is being held in Hutchinson, Kansas.
We're hosting it at Hutchinson Fire Department, and because they've had a lot of that type of issue in that area, they wanted to partner with us on hosting that, and it's November 28th and 29th. They're at their training center in Hutchinson.
Where can people find more information if they think this training pertains to them?
On the Kansas Forest Service Facebook page, on our website, and those would be the two primary places to go look for that.
Again, the training is the 28th and 29th. That's a Wednesday and a Thursday, and the registration deadline is November 21st. That just helps out the planning committee, correct?
Exactly, yeah. We could take them later than that, but it sure helps us to plan to have it at least a week ahead of time, know who's coming.
The 2-day training is free, and it will help with the mitigation of fire risks to residential structures, so a great course for fire departments especially, as the Kansas Forest Service has a lot of expertise with fire mitigation. And while you're here in the studio, Jason, would you like to give us an update from the Kansas Forest Service on what's been going on? Will you give us an update from the Forest Service?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, and especially in the fire program. Most folks in Kansas are aware that we've had 2 very active fire seasons the last 3 years, and even last year was fairly active. It wasn't as active as the previous 2, but it was still fairly active. And like a lot of other agencies, our agency is looking to try to respond to that, to be better prepared to help the local fire departments, who are always going to be, they're the first and foremost protection against those things, and always will be. But we've just wanted to try to be better positioned to help them when they do need a little bit extra help. One way we've been able to do that, we've actually added an additional staff, which I'm here almost 14 years. It's the first time we've added staff in the fire program, so pretty excited. And in the southwest Kansas area is an area we've noticed we don't have as much presence in the fire program as we'd like, so we've added out of Garden City an additional, I call it a district fire management officer position. Aaron Williams is his name, out of Garden City. He's with us since June, I believe. He started with us to just be out in that area, building relationships with fire departments, helping with training, helping with whatever those fire departments need, equipment inventories, and those kind of things. So we're excited about that. And then also this past spring, the longtime coordinator of our program retired, and in July we were able to rehire a new fire management officer to run the program, and his name's Mark Neely. He started in July, and so we've got some new faces, and we're excited to have them on board and help us get going to, like I said, just be in better position to help the fire departments.
Sure. Sounds like the fire program is doing well and ready to have people equipped here for the upcoming fire season. Thank you for coming in, Jason, and speaking with us today.
Thanks again for having me.
That was Jason Hartman, a fire protection specialist with the Kansas Forest Service, coming in to talk about several wildfire considerations this winter, what's been setting the scene for folks to be prepared, but also be cautious as the season progresses. The Kansas Forest Service is the nation's 5th oldest state forestry agency. It serves rural landowners, communities, rural fire districts, and other industries, and then, of course, the citizens of the state. You can find more information relating to wildfires or other resources that the Kansas Forest Service offers through their website, kansasforests.org. We'll have more here coming up. I'm Sarah Moyer. Stay tuned on Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128 plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And next up for you, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Well, time is running short for Farm Bill negotiators to wrap up their work and complete the legislation for floor debates and a final vote this year, that according to the chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee. Pat Roberts yesterday said that he, Senate Agriculture Committee Ranking Member Debbie Stabenow, and House Agriculture Committee Ranking Member Colin Peterson are in agreement about how to move ahead. But Roberts alluded to House Agriculture Committee Chairman Michael Conaway saying he was still proposing some areas of compromise. Now, lawmakers have been working since late summer to come to an agreement on the 5-year authorizing bills. Differences between the House and Senate versions primarily involving the work and job training requirements for single able-bodied adults on Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program aid, but also to reach agreement on differences in provisions in the commodity titles and the conservation programs. Now, Peterson said last week he doesn't want the Farm Bill to carry over to the new Congress in 2019 because he will likely have several new members on the committee following the election, saying that it takes time to get up to speed on some of the complexities of farm programs, crop insurance, and USDA agencies. Congress is in session this week, then goes on Thanksgiving break next week until November the 27th. Lawmakers have to approve some key spending bills to keep the government from shutting down before the December 7th deadline. The House right now is scheduled to wrap up the year on December 13th. The Senate's target date to end is December the 14th. Roberts said the congressional staff needs 10 days to get the paperwork done on the Farm Bill language and get the cost scores back from the Congressional Budget Office. Roberts indicated he would like to see an agreement reached that would allow the chairman and ranking members of the House and Senate Agriculture Committees to agree to go forward on a bill. Bayer on Tuesday disclosed another jump in the number of lawsuits alleging that the company's recently acquired glyphosate herbicides cause cancer. Lawsuits from 9,300 plaintiffs were pending at the end of October. That compared with 8,700 at the end of August. According to Bayer, plaintiffs are claiming that Roundup, which Bayer acquired in its takeover of Monsanto, made them ill and that Monsanto knew or should have known of the risks but failed to warn adequately. Bayer rejects the allegations, arguing there are hundreds of scientific studies and regulatory authorities that demonstrate glyphosate is safe to use. The trouble for Bayer began back on August the 10th when a San Francisco jury held Monsanto liable for a former groundskeeper's terminal non-Hodgkin lymphoma and ordered a heavy fine on the U.S. company. At the time, Bayer had limited latitude to defend itself as it yet wasn't allowed to officially control Monsanto, pending the asset sales required by antitrust authorities to close that acquisition of the U.S. agricultural giant. In late October, the San Francisco judge reduced that August jury award down to $78.5 million, down from $289 million, but maintained the jury's verdict. Then Monsanto acted with malice. Bayer is now appealing the verdict with the California Court of Appeal, which it says is a single judgment that is not binding for other cases. Bayer had been arguing that attorneys for the plaintiff, Dwayne Johnson, had relied on flimsy scientific evidence to prove a link to his cancer and that they had swayed the jurors with overly emotional and speculative arguments. Meanwhile, the number of lawsuits has continued to rise, and plaintiffs' lawyers have aired ads seeking new Roundup plaintiffs, particularly since that verdict came out. So far this year, some 24,000 such TV ads have aired at an estimated cost of $5.7 million. The wave of lawsuits started after the International Agency for Research on Cancer, that's a unit of the World Health Organization, back in 2015, classified glyphosate as likely having the potential to cause cancer. That decision came despite numerous other studies that have shown no link between cancer and glyphosate. And the Japanese government's Food Safety Commission is moving closer to removing import restrictions on U.S. beef, facing pressure to scrap the current restrictions allowing only U.S. beef from cattle aged 30 months of age or younger due to the concerns over BSC. The Food Safety Commission of Japan planning to convene a meeting of its research unit today to seek approval of the plan on lifting the restrictions. Time now for you for this week's Kansas soybean update. Here's Greg Akagi.
Marcia Boswell joins us. She serves as conference co-chair for the Women Managing the Farm Conference. And Marcia, registration is now open for the 2019 Women Managing the Farm Conference, February 7th and 8th in Manhattan.
So if you register by December 14th, you can get the early bird rate. So if you are thinking about coming to the conference, it would be great to go ahead and get registered.
You've got quite a lineup this year as far as keynote speakers for what has been a great conference that's taken place since 2005.
So we have 4 keynote speakers lined up for this year's conference. Jason Lusk, who is a food and ag economist, and he's the author of Food Police. He's going to be our opening keynote speaker on that Thursday morning. And then we have attorney Stacy Seibel from Hayes, who's going to be talking about estate planning. Dr. Michael Taylor from K-State is going to be presenting on navigating negotiations. And then our wrap-up keynote on Friday afternoon is Amanda Friend. She is a farmer from Connecticut, and she's going to be sharing farm stories from the family's kitchen table. We also have the pre-conference sessions.
That will take place on February the 6th, and a lot of activity taking place for that, too.
Women actually have 4 different opportunities for pre-conference sessions this time. And one that we've offered in the past is QuickBooks, and this time we're going to have a beginner session in the morning on that Wednesday, and then a more advanced session in the afternoon. We'll also have 2 choices where people can be bused over to the Highland Community College campus there in Wamego and learn about viticulture and precision ag.
And networking is such a great avenue here.
Yeah, and we're actually changing up the networking sessions a little bit this year. It's been a more formal setting in the past. And this time we're going to have round tables where people can break into small groups and share their stories among each other. And that's just a great opportunity for networking.
If people want more information and get in before the early pre-registration deadline, what's the best way they can do that?
That is on the website at womenmanagingthefarm.com. We also have a Facebook page, which is facebook.com/womenmanagingthefarm. And we are posting the different information for the keynote speakers, but we don't have the breakout sessions all completely on the website yet. So go on the Facebook page and follow that so that as we're adding those breakout sessions, you'll be able to follow along and see what's available.
That is Marcia Boswell, who serves as the conference co-chair for the 2019 Women Managing the Farm Conference. She's been our guest on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. And this is Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. This Agriculture Today closes out with our weekly K-State horticulture segment, and the focus this time around is on winterizing those roses, so prominent in our Kansas landscapes, and in fact, what, if any, damage might have occurred from our recent cold snap, highly unusual for the earlier part of November. We'll get into all of that now with Dennis Patton. Dennis, as you know, is the Extension Horticultural Agent for Johnson County in northeast Kansas. And before we go any further on the winterization process, just right to it, Dennis. We've had some awfully cold weather for the mid part of fall, and would that likely have hurt our roses that weren't quite ready for the winter yet?
You know, Eric, that is a really darn good question. I think it's one of those answers that time will tell. But my concern is, we dropped down to single digits here in the Kansas City area, and the plants were not really ready for that cold drop that quickly. A lot of them have not gone into dormancy yet, and I'm fearful that a lot of our roses and some of our other plants are probably going to have quite a bit of dieback come spring of 2019. I think it's one of those we're going to have to wait and see, but at this point in time, I think we got to, how does that go? Plan for the worst, hope for the best, something like that, and making sure we get our roses through the rest of this winter weather.
Which we'll talk about, but when you suggest the possibility of dieback here, not so much that it would wipe out the plant entirely, but simply knock back some of those canes?
Well, that gets back into what type of rose we're growing and how was it produced. There's 2 ways we see roses on the market real commonly. One is what we call a grafted tea rose, and for the most part, that's our hybrid tea roses, like the Peace Rose, the Julia Childs, Mr. Lincoln, President Lincoln, all those really hybrid tea, real showy, large roses. And most of those are grafted onto a seedling rootstock. And if that graft dies, so does your named variety of roses. But in the last 10, 15, 20 years now, most people have been planting these easy care roses. Most people just call them knockout roses. And those roses aren't grafted. They are grown on their own root. An example would be if that rose killed back to the ground and it suckered up from below the soil surface, it's going to be the knockout rose because it's not grafted onto another rootstock. So the way to know whether your rose is grafted or not is to look for a big knot or a big joint. Usually the protrusion is where that graft was made. And unlike those easy care roses, it's more like a shrub. You just got sticks coming out of the ground and you don't see that graft union.
You mentioned the grafted roses, and maybe they're a little more sensitive to swift temperature changes to the downside. Is there anything one can do to shield them from the harsher cold weather?
Yes, that's exactly what we do. We protect that graft union. So the most common way to do that is just put a mound or cone of soil, compost, over the center of that plant. So we're going to bury that crown in this 6 to 8 inch cone or mound of soil or compost, because that then kind of insulates it from we've already had the extreme cold, but normally from the extreme cold that is still yet to come in winter. And it just gives that, it's not that it keeps it warm, but it really stops it from those fluctuating temperatures so much that could then spell doom to that graft union. So cover them up with that 6-8 inch mound of soil, compost, something along those lines to give it a little bit extra winter protection on the grafted hybrid tea roses.
So one doesn't have to be necessarily fussy about the kind of mulch they're using. Any number of materials will do?
Yeah, I think a lot of times people just kind of use what they have. The old recommendation is bringing in some quality garden soil, but now what you see a lot more is people just using wood chip mulch or compost, because then at the end of the season, next March, April, you can just go in there, take your trowel, your fingers, and just pull that mulch away from that graft union, spread it out in the garden, and you're good to go. As opposed to bringing that soil into the garden, and you've got something to do with it, because you have to remove it back from the plant itself. You just don't want to continue to bury those plants deeper in the soil. That would not be good for it.
As for those easy care roses, the knockouts, as they're often referred to, does one have to do anything to winterize them to any extent?
That's where the term easy care comes into play. Basically, walk away from them and you're done. As I explained earlier, they're, for the most part, on their own roots. So if we did have extreme cold like the snap we had earlier this week, killed them back to the ground, all we really need to do is wait till spring or late winter when we start seeing new growth appear, and then just go in there and cut those easy care roses back to live tissue or live buds. Or in some cases, if it's really bad, it could come up from below the ground. So it's just kind of be patient. Of course, that's the same principle we're going to follow on these grafted roses too. We're just going to wait for new growth come March, early April next year. And we're going to go in and just start pruning down. And the first cuts we're going to make is always get all that dead wood out of there, because it serves absolutely no purpose to the plant. And then from there, we can start shaping our bushes for a successful summer.
Sort of to that point, Dennis, is there any need for pre-winter pruning of roses for any purpose whatsoever?
That's probably a really good question. I think the only time I do any pruning here in the fall would be if you got some really tall, lanky canes that could snap off in the wind. So a lot of times we'll say maybe take those hybrid teas back to 24, 18 inches, because you're going to prune them down lower anyway. But on the knockout easy care roses, here again, I'd probably just walk away from them and then just kind of do more what I call the one-cut pruning method in the spring when you know what's live or dead. But those hybrid teas, the way those canes come out of that graft area, a lot of times they're not as secure or tightly held. And I've seen cases where you get a little bit of snow, a little bit of ice, you get a little wind, those canes can lodge or break over, and that's what we're trying to prevent happening.
So if you have, say, not so much bush roses, but climbing roses, one might want to cut those back a bit for that very reason?
Eric, you bring up climbing roses, and that's a whole other animal.
Okay.
Climbing roses bloom a little bit different than our hybrid teas or grafted roses and our easy care roses. On climbing roses, some people will take those canes down off the trellis and cover them and bury them. They really give great winter protection. I'm going to guess since they're really thorny and kind of wound together, most people don't do that. So my advice on the climbing roses is maybe mulch around the base if they're grafted, but the canes up in the air, just kind of let them be subject to the winter conditions. And then here again comes spring, once growth begins, just start tracing back on those canes and taking out the dead wood, because we don't really overly prune climbing roses till after that first flush of bloom, because their best bloom comes on this concept of old wood growth versus new wood growth, which is different from knockout roses and the hybrid tea roses.
Again, there's some thoughts on winterizing your ornamental roses. And Dennis, we appreciate the input. Many thanks.
Good talking to you today, Eric.
That's Dennis Patton, Johnson County Extension Horticultural Agent, on this week's K-State Horticulture segment. And that is our time for today. Thanks for tuning in. For Sarah Moyer, Eric Atkinson here, this has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.